All right, let's get right into it. We all have these ideas, right, about what really makes a student do well in school. Is it having wealthy parents, a house just crammed with books? Maybe it's being on the soccer team. Well, today, we're going to push all those assumptions aside and look at what years of research actually tells us.
This is the big question, isn't it? It's the one that parents, teachers, and honestly entire governments have been wrestling with forever. And if we want to find the real answer, we've got to look past the easy stereotypes and dig into the cold, hard evidence. So our guide on this quest is a researcher named Edgar Demetrio Tovar Garcia. Think of him as our lead detective. He spent years sifting through data from thousands of Russian students to piece this whole puzzle together. And by focusing specifically on Russia, his work gives us this really unique perspective that, as you'll see, challenges some pretty major beliefs.
So, where does an investigation like this even begin? Well, you start at the most obvious place, the family. Tovar Garcia's research kicked off by testing all those factors that we pretty much all assume are the most important things in a kid's academic life.
Okay, before we go any further, we need to get our heads around this key concept called cultural capital. The easiest way to think about it is this: it's not about the money in your bank account. It's about the wealth of knowledge, the habits, and the cultural environment you grow up in.
Now, what's so cool here is how this research took an abstract idea and made it totally concrete. How do you measure something like cultural capital? Well, he looked for specifics. Did the family have over 500 books? Did they own classics by authors like Tolstoy or Pushkin? How often did parents actually sit down and check homework? These things became the tangible fingerprints of cultural capital.
And you know, the first finding wasn't a huge shocker. The data absolutely confirmed that, yep, having a strong family background with a lot of cultural and economic resources gives students a serious leg up. So case closed, right? Ha, not even close. This is where our story really starts to get interesting. So, for the next part of the investigation, we move outside the home and into the world of extracurriculars. And this is where the first few twists in our story start to appear, because it turns out context is everything.
Check this out. The data revealed something really specific. Taking your kid to a museum or the theater was strongly linked to better grades. But, and this is a huge but, only if a parent went with them. When students went to these same places on their own, or say with a school trip, the research found no measurable academic benefit. Parental involvement was the secret ingredient.
And here's another perfect example of that same idea. Playing sports was also linked to better grades, but again, where you played was what mattered. Being on a club team outside of school, that showed a positive effect. But sports done at school, like in gym class, turns out there was no significant link to grades whatsoever.
But there is a fascinating catch to the sports thing. The research found a tipping point. For boys, if they spent more than 10 hours a week on sports, it actually started to have a negative effect, and their chances of getting higher grades went down. So it looks like there's a real sweet spot for balancing athletics and academics.
All right, let's move on to our next clue. We've looked at the external stuff, family, activities, but what about what's going on inside a student's head? Tovar Garcia's research also dug into a really powerful psychological trait. And that trait is called grit. You've probably heard of it. It's not about being the smartest kid in the room or having the highest IQ. It's all about sticking with your goals day in and day out, especially when things get tough. It's that drive to finish what you start. And in the Russian data, the result was crystal clear. Students who scored higher on the grit scale didn't just have better grades, they were also way more likely to say they planned on going to university. This internal drive, this mindset, turned out to be a huge piece of the success puzzle all on its own.
So far, all the pieces kind of fit together logically, right? But this final part of our investigation, this is where things get really wild. This is where the research uncovered something that challenges some of the most common assumptions we have about education, not just in Russia, but all over the world.
Let's talk about migration for a second. There's this globally recognized idea in education, often called the assimilation hypothesis. And it basically says that students from migrant families have this uphill battle and often lag behind their native-born classmates. That seems like a given, doesn't it? Well, hold on. The data from Russia tells a completely different story. After the researchers controlled for other things like family income, Tovar Garcia found that a student's migration background had, well, no effect. There was just no statistically significant gap between migrant and native students.
This slide really puts the most startling findings right next to each other. First, like we just saw, that migrant achievement gap we talk so much about in the West, it just didn't show up in this data.
But the second finding here is even more incredible. The research from Tatarstan showed that students who spoke the minority language, Tatar, at home, they didn't just keep up, they often got better grades than their native Russian-speaking classmates.
So, what this all means is that in the Russian context that was studied, two major global ideas about education are completely flipped on their head. Being from a migrant family isn't a disadvantage, and speaking a second language at home is actually an asset. Bilingualism is a strength, not a weakness.
And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. This deep dive into the Russian data didn't just solve one puzzle. It actually forces us to question our own universal beliefs about what it takes to succeed in school. It's a powerful reminder that what we all just assume is true might just depend on where you're looking.